Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. So I want to kind of have a video discussion where I want to introspect about a recent choice that I made surrounding an editing decision on the video that I released on my main channel on Friday surrounding the anti-trans bigotry that is growing more and more in the United States. Because I think this introspection that I'm having about the choice is something that I think we all need to be doing a lot more in a lot of our sort of advocacy as we work to fight growing authoritarianism and fascism within the United States. Especially for those of us who sit at an interesting intersection of having both certain levels of privilege in our country, especially being white like I am, while also having, many different intersections of being oppressed, as I am as a woman and as a trans person. In the video that I released on Friday, I had a sort of much longer discussion about the need to use self-defense in the face of violence being stoked against trans people. Right now, clearly we are seeing a rise in anti-trans rhetoric that is stoking violence against trans people, whether it be stochastic terrorism or it be state violence like legislations being pushed against us, and many other different ways that violence has been sort of targeted at the trans community. And in that discussion, I talked about sort of this ongoing discourse that's been having right now around, trans people being seen as violent and bullies when pushing back against these authoritarian and harmful and genocidal rhetorics. One recent example of this discourse in microcosm was surrounding a recent counter-protest to kellie-jay keen-minshull that happened in New Zealand and Australia, where kellie-jay keen-minshull, the anti-trans figure, TERF, got hit with tomato juice. And I argued that, moments like that, where there is some sort of I hesitate to even call it physical violence because it's like tomato juice on her face, but some people would argue it as an assault, that is warranted in the face of, harm being done to the trans community. And that when we sort of push back, whether we, punch Nazis in the face or do things like that, that is self-defensive. That is a thing where you are pushing back against people stoking violence who are often able to make their violence seem invisible through the use of state power or just using respectability politics. And one thing I mentioned in the video was there were people who understandably balked at this argument, who said, well, we should try to not use violence in any form. We should use nonviolence. And one of the things I said in the video was this. But even beyond the anti-trans talking points, there were many people who were trans-supportive who seemed to balk at events like this. That we should be nonviolent in the face of violence being done against us.
I don't agree with the soup thing. What goes around comes around, and it may become a method or acceptable action to be taken by the other side against trans people and their allies. Great that the people are motivated to peacefully support their allies in such numbers.
A call for civility, to say, well, we should just debate them in the marketplace of ideas, or do nonviolent protests against them. I certainly very much understand where these comments come from. In fact, just a few years ago, I very much would have echoed them. They come from an understandable place of not wishing any violence to have to occur, and being upset at seeing violence happen. And the sometimes sweet, earnest, and somewhat innocent belief that the right cause can win without violence. And while I definitely think that nonviolence has its place in movements like this, and I think we should try to use it as a first tactic, it is sadly at the point where that may not be continually able to be the case. But we must remember that events like Stonewall, which sparked the modern LGBTQ rights movement, was itself a violent riot against state power. Sometimes you need to throw a brick at people who are willing to do more violence against you and your body. World War II itself was a war against fascism that was only won through violence. Violence is not something to be sought or desired, but fighting fascism is. While fascism and authoritarianism often gets to hide its violence through the utilization of state power, scapegoats, and stochastic terrorism, trans people and other marginalized groups who are harmed are often doing self-defense for ourselves quite publicly. And to be very clear, I am not sitting here being like, yay, I'm very excited about that fact. We also need to be honest about it. Sometimes, beating fascism cannot be done or stopped non-violently. And it's important to note that when people are doing that, it is not because they themselves are violent or hateful. They are doing it out of self-defense. Trans people pushing back against fascists calling for our genocide through state violence are being self-defensive. We are not the ones instigating the violence. And I still agree with that statement to a certain extent. That it is understandable that there are people who are like, I don't want to see any violence used because, they don't like violence. And that's an understandable impulse. We shouldn't want to use violence. I hate violence and I abhor violence. But the other thing that I didn't put in the video is this discussion about how that viewpoint is also coming from a certain place of privilege. There are people who don't have the privilege to not be able to push back against fascism and hate and bigotry. We have to be self-defensive because people are literally causing violence against us. And to say that we should just take it on the chin is usually coming from people who aren't in direct harm. That's why we have that poem that goes, first they came for the socialists, then and da-da-da-da-da-da, so on down the line until they came for me and there was no one to stand with me. It's because the perspective of that poem is from someone who thought like, well, I don't need to stand up for them. I'm seeing them being harmed, but like, I don't think we should be like fighting back that way because they had the privilege to not be worried at that moment for their own personal safety, and how it's important for not only people to fight back against these things when it is targeting them, but how other people should recognize when people are being targeted and come after them, not sort of rest in their privilege and say, no, I actually need to stand up for these people because they're being attacked, and later on down the line, I could be attacked too because fascism is a machine that constantly looks for another target to oppress in order to fuel its endless need for cult of death, cult of war, endless like infighting and sort of binary like us versus them rhetorics. So that element is very much, that desire to not wish to engage in violence or, self-defensive violence to be able to push back against rhetorics does come from a certain level of privilege. Now, that was something that I didn't even really think about discussing in the video because I was sort of writing the video very fast. I wrote this video in 2 days and things like that. But one thing that I did write and actually shoot for the video, but ultimately took out because I felt it was a bit of a sidetrack, and now I'm realizing much more that it actually was very pertinent to what I should have been discussing, there was a moment in the video where I actually called out people who were quoting Martin Luther King Jr. In videos that I had done earlier on that week where I discussed the keen-minshull situation to argue for nonviolence. Basically, they were arguing that Martin Luther King Jr. was a man who argued for nonviolent protest in the face of, harm being done to the Black community. And that's an example that we should follow. And I'm going to show you the part of the video that I cut out. And then I want to have a little discussion afterwards about why I cut that section out of the video, beyond just me feeling it was a bit of a sidetrack. So here's the section. And please, by the way, do not quote Martin Luther King in my comment section as I saw other people in my other videos' comment sections do. While I completely understand that you are coming from a desire to not wish to see violence done, and I understand and empathize with that, it's important to remember that Martin Luther King Jr. himself was open about the sometimes regrettable need for violence in the face of hatred and violence being enacted against marginalized groups like Black people that he was an advocate for. And he realized this before he himself was murdered violently, despite his repeated usage and calls for nonviolence to be used first in fights against discrimination and bigotry. Also, Martin Luther King Jr. was super anti-capitalist, by the way. Honestly, Martin Luther King Jr. is highly extraordinary in many ways. But the myth of Martin Luther King Jr. being a revered saint who worked to end racism solely through nonviolent and individual means is a narrative that is often wielded by conservatives to preach the idea that we should only be fighting those causing harm in the marketplace of ideas and ignore that systemic injustices even exist. A narrative which ultimately only serves those who cause harm because it legitimizes their arguments and pushes the idea to remain neutral in the face of violence being enacted, especially if that violence is being made invisible through systems and utilizations of state power, like anti-trans legislations are.
Today is the anniversary of the assassination of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I was thinking, if he were alive today, I wonder what he'd think about such dismissive comments and about a Democrat Party that believes it can regain power by living in a constant state of protest or racial hatred and denial.
Every one of us has a right to equal treatment by our government. That right is guaranteed by our Constitution. It's the heart of countless laws passed with well-deserved fanfare by our Congress over many decades. That right is inscribed on a monument on our National Mall to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who would be shocked and disgusted if he watched Susan Rice on television today.
Okay, so I very much stand by what I say in that section. And I want to sort of go a little bit further for just a second here. In the last few years before Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, was murdered, he started to become much more leftist and sort of anti-capitalist and anti the system that oppressed many people of color, black people, and many others. In fact, here's a famous quote that a lot of people know, but sort of missed the beginning part of it.
Let me say, as I've always said, and I will always continue to say, that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. I'm still convinced that non-violence is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom and justice. I feel that violence will only create more social problems than they will solve, and that in a real sense it is impractical for the Negro to even think of mounting a violent revolution in the United States. So I will continue to condemn riots and continue to say to my brothers and sisters that this is not the way, continue to affirm that there is another way. But at the same time, it is as necessary for me to be as vigorous in condemning the conditions which cause persons to feel that they must engage in riotous activities as it is for me to condemn riots. I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
So, as you can hear at the beginning of that quote, is Martin Luther King Jr. saying, firstly, that, the ability for black people at the time that he was alive to fight back against the system was ultimately going to be very harmful to black people. And so he argued for nonviolence because that was the way to cause tension within the system and force the system to try to acknowledge and work for black people, to sort of stop the oppression of black people. And so he sort of recognizes not the fact that violence shouldn't be used, but ultimately he believed at that time that violence was something that was going to basically be a losing battle for black people, considering how ubiquitous the system is. But as he got later in his life before he was murdered, and I should call out FD Signifier's amazing video that is not released yet. He's going to be going into this in further detail. But one of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. sort of was wrestling with as he got further into his life was becoming more anti-capitalist, more leftist, and starting to understand that the system that oppressed black people and many others needed to continually be fought back against and pushed back against, and that it is often a conservative rhetoric that sort of erases this part of his history to just say you should call for nonviolence, just like Martin Luther King Jr. is. I'm not saying every conservative, every person who says nonviolence is the way, in quotes, Martin Luther King Jr. is a conservative, but it is a conservative rhetoric to uphold the status quo, saying use nonviolence because if you use nonviolence, it'll disrupt the status quo, and we don't want to do that. It's harmful, and so it ultimately keeps propping up the status quo of the system. And this is something that I think Martin Luther King Jr. himself, again, I'm sort of coming off the cuff as not like a deep scholar of his life, but something that, seemingly he was wrestling with as he got further into his life, and started to recognize that the system was being harmful. So that's something that I encourage you all to learn more about from FD's video. He'll go into it in much greater detail, and I think it's a really great video. But the last thing that I want to analyze in this little discussion that we've been having here is the other element of why I took that section out of my video. Because I did say earlier, and this is true, I thought it was a little bit of a sidetrack from the point that I was making. And now I'm realizing, given everything that I just said, that it was actually a very pertinent thing to what I was saying. But I also have been doing a little bit of introspection, and I realized that the other reason that I did this, and I don't know if I was even conscious of it because I was editing and kind of dealing with a lot of other emotions at the time, but I sort of sit in here and think about like, yeah, maybe that was an emotion that I was thinking, was the fact that, by putting that section in the video, and maybe even by putting it here, there might be people who react negatively to this, is that some people would take that as an affront to them and say like, oh, Jessie, they might have been people like cis people who were like trying to listen to the video and were agreeing with my points, but then they would have felt like I was confronting them and calling them a bad person for wanting to quote MLK. And I realized that was an impulse on my part to not wish to make people look at this history of Martin Luther King Jr., to look at the fact that, yes, this man was someone who was understanding that we needed to fight the system, and didn't want to make people who I wanted to come out of the video feeling like, yeah, we need to fight the system, as I say in the video, feel bad for maybe having quoted Martin Luther King Jr. or not understood that element of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. And by censoring that part of the video, again, I don't know if this was conscious or not, but by censoring that, I sort of was trying to take away that moment of self-introspection on the part of the people watching the video, because maybe they would have had a sort of like balking reaction at that. And I understood, and I'm understanding now that that was an element of my privilege to want to cut out that section of the video for, so not to confront certain people in my audience with that reality of the long history of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. And it's something that I need to be better aware of, because I think, it is important for me to constantly point out the intersectionality of so many of the fights that trans people that, I am are facing alongside many other groups. I've constantly talked about how the issues that trans people are facing in the United States are not ones isolated to just trans people, but are often intersecting with many other things like anti-Semitism and racism and things like that. And then on top of that, how many of these intersections make people of color within the trans community, like Black folks and especially Indigenous folks as well, face even greater harm. Indigenous trans women and Black trans women and many other trans women of color face a lot more harm than I do as a white trans woman living in a state that is fairly trans affirming in the United States, despite the fact that, I do face a lot of harassment and hate and things like that as well. But it is much more compounded for many others who aren't of my class or my race. And so I think that is something that I need to be aware of, that I am sometimes, I hope you all are seeing this, that I am trying my best to be more conscious of that and trying to center that more and more and more. But I am on a learning journey on that. And I think that, I kind of want to be open about me being on a learning journey, not so that people don't hold me accountable and say like, oh, Jessie, she's just learning, she's figuring out, but to let all of you all know who may be on a similar learning journey as me, to know that it is a process of constantly introspecting and not letting that introspection make us feel paralyzed. We shouldn't feel like, we can't do anything, but to confront it in a way that allows us to have a more open and frank discussion so that we can stand in better solidarity with, other communities that we are not a part of, but are also facing a fight that we are fighting all together against a system that harms us all in many ways, and also be more inclusive of the people who are within our communities that we, hope to work within, like the trans community for myself, who are more harmed, and bring their voices forward for themselves and not speak for them, but try to acknowledge them more and try to bring them forward much more as well. And this is something I'm going to be doing much more in my videos. I've been trying to do already in my videos, but it's something that I just sort of like sat and thought about, even though it was like a 2-second part of my video, and realized, I think, I could have not had this discussion, and maybe this video will, get people upset at me, but I hope you understand that I'm making this video off the cuff because I want to kind of acknowledge that this isn't something that, it should be something that is like sat down and thought of when you're making videos and content and writing, but it's also something that we wrestle with in our everyday thinking about how we think about the world. So I want to show you, hopefully, me wrestling with it as a person rather than as a person who wrote a script and sat down and performed a video for all of you. Hopefully that all made sense, and, if I said anything dumb or offensive, please call me out in the comments. Again, I am on a learning journey, and I want to be confronted with things that I screw up. But yeah, let's figure this all out together. So, sending love to all of you out there.